Well, welcome back to Beyond the Sermon, where Sean and I bring some answers to some questions that you guys have concerning the sermon. And this last week, Sean, you talked about Jesus plus nothing equals relationships of wholeness and holiness. But us humans are pretty awesome and sometimes not awesome, where we bring, some provoking into those relationships, and envy are part of those relationships, and it just messes up the whole equation, right? But Jesus is like, no, you got to pursue holiness and wholeness, right? That's what we've been talking about. But are relationships always super easy? Are they always perfect?
Oh man, yeah. I've got the book written, figured it. No.
Can you give it to me?
Relationships are complicated. It's messy. It's unpredictable.
Right.
Like, that's real life.
That's how relationships are, right? So if someone came to you and said, man, I am striving for holiness and wholeness, but it's not working out, right? Like, it's one-sided, and it's just, this relationship is just not working out. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I can relate. I think that you hear a message like we did this weekend, and it's about just this, man, this is the perfection of what relationships can be. And we unfortunately, a series like this can make our relationships feel like a formula. Oh, all I need is Jesus, and I'll have the best buddies in the in the world. And the reality is that's not always accurate. It is tough. You try to develop an accountability relationship, and then they kind of drift apart, and you don't always stay in contact, or you try to be there for somebody, but they won't ask for help. I think what Paul would say to this, and it's right after the section we preached this weekend. We didn't have time to really get into this part of the text in Galatians, but later in Galatians 6, he says, simply, do not give up. Don't get tired or weary of doing what is good. And it comes after this section that is very famous about you reap what you sow. And that gardening analogy of you get what you plant, right? And so I wonder if Paul's talking and just saying, gosh, I understand relationships are complicated. And you're going to reap what you sow in your friendships and in your marriage and in your parenting and in your relationships in general. But they are complicated and they're messy. And he uses this analogy, right, of reaping what you sow, or you get what you plant. Yeah. Which I think is emblematic of relationships. Gardening is messy and complicated and unpredictable. I hate gardening, but I am not a gardener, but I think the gardening analogy works, right? In terms of friendships and relationships. Like, if I plant selfishness in that friendship, well, then I'm going to get competition. I'm going to use people to get what I want. If I plant arrogance, well, then I'm going to belittle people and step over people and think I'm better than you. But if I plant the gospel into those relationships, that's what Paul's getting at. Don't get tired of putting the gospel into those relationships. Then what are you going to see? You're going to see accountability. You're going to see wholeness. You're going to see a harvest. And that's what he promises. You will see a harvest at some point. Don't give up. You will see a harvest. So those that are frustrated or tired, or you've been there, done that in the church, and you've tried a life group, and you've tried accountability and all of this, like, I would just say, don't give up. Keep trying, keep investing, keep going, push through that awkwardness and that difficulty, because there is a harvest to be benefited or to be reaped. And that's the benefit of putting these gospel characteristics into our life and into our relationships.
Yeah. So we're pursuing wholeness, and we're pursuing holiness within our relationships. And I don't think we should want to be divided, right? Like, that shouldn't be our heart for relationships. But when is it healthy and necessary to separate? Where is that line in the sand when we need to separate in those relationships?
Yeah, this is a tough one, because you're looking at a cancel culture, right? But the moment you bother me, I cancel you.
I'm done.
I'm out. We do that on a broad spectrum, but we could do that in relationships too. I've realized through counseling and reflection and things that I tend to have that tendency with folks. You bother me, you ruffle my feathers, I am less likely to want to engage. And that continues to happen. Well, then I'm going to get farther and farther apart. And I think where I'm feeling a conviction with this question and looking at Paul's letter is, one, in Galatians, he doesn't really address this. So I think it speaks to the nature of you continue to fight for that wholeness. Like, don't give up on people, because Jesus wouldn't give up on people. And in fact, if you look at Jesus' words, what does he say? When you have an enemy, what are you supposed to do with them?
Pray for them.
Unfriend them. No, he says, yes, he says pray for them. Yeah, he says love your enemies, right? And I think what it shows is the idea that we go our separate ways needs to be one of the last courses of action, right? And Paul doesn't really speak to that idea of being separated. His life lived that out in Acts. We see that. Acts 15, he separates from Barnabas. Like, they have a major conflict, and the best decision is, I'm going to go here, you're going to go there. Yeah. He has a major separation in Corinth in Acts 18. He's preaching to the Jewish people. They're abusive. They're in opposition to him. They hate Paul. They're anti-Paul. And his course of action is he kind of shakes the dust off, right? He just kind of like, okay, guys, I'm out, right? That's what it says. He literally shook off the dust and got out of there and just said, I am going to go reach these people then. Yeah. If you don't want me around, I'm going over here. But what I'm strongly convicted in is in both cases, they talked about it. It's a separation where he didn't just ghost them. Yeah. He didn't just unfriend them. He fought for those relationships. He pushed through the awkwardness. And then at some point, they have to have a difficult conversation to say, gosh, if we're going to stop spending time together, this is for both of our benefit. Yeah. Because us being together right now is awkward and difficult and not leading to holiness and wholeness. Yeah,
that's the difference right there, right? You're not just leaving to create more brokenness. There's a separation that creates a holiness and a wholeness in that relationship. Thinking about those tough decisions, what are some of those things that actually warrant a change like that, a separation right like that? Because we are learning to pursue and don't give up on those relationships. But would you say there are some things that warrant that separation in our life? What are those things?
Yeah, well, and just looking at like Paul's life, I think what you see is relationships that are abusive, divided, where they're not really listening to each other and trying to exercise grace in those types of relationships where you can sense that kind of friction, where it's like, we've hit an impasse. We've done what Jesus said. We've brought in other folks. We've brought in a third party. We've prayed about this. We've talked about this. We're just log jamming at this point because there is such a disagreement of conflict. And it got to the point where they don't view each other as whole people in that way. I don't think the Jews looked at Paul as whole, and so they had to separate. I think Paul and Barnabas hit a point, they hit an impasse where, I guess, the gospel message is going to be affected if we stay together. This is going to hurt our message if we stay. So we've got to separate. Right. And I think that, it's complicated. It's not a cookie cutter. There's no checklist. We're not going to have a
blanket statement either always that's for this situation we have the perfect formula either, right? No.
Yeah, and so there's going to be people where they do leave your life. Yeah. And we live in a smaller town, so you may still see them.
Yeah, so how does that happen, right? Like, I'm learning that I don't have to be best friends with everybody and spend all this time with them, but how does Jesus call me to treat those people where there's been a separation, where there's been conflict? How do I still pursue a relationship of wholeness, but from from the nosebleed section, right? Like,
he says to love them, right? So love your enemies, love those that are against you, because if you're only loving those that like you, what good is that? Yeah. And so I think in a very practical way, like you run into each other at the store. When you hit each other in Fred Meyer, and you see each other, don't avoid them. Don't act awkward around them. Like, just be kind. Yeah. Show gentleness. Ask a question. See how they're doing. Yeah. Don't make it weird. Like, it's as weird as you make it, right? Yeah. And some people would say, well, I'm not being genuine. I'm not being authentic. And I would just say, like, is it disingenuine to be kind?
Shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be. No. Because one of the fruit of the Spirit that Paul says in Galatians 5 is what? Kindness. Yeah. Gentleness, goodness. Like, those are the attributes of the Holy Spirit in your life. So when you run into each other, it should, it may feel a little awkward, but you know what? God still says that they matter. Yeah. So let's show kindness to them. Let's show gentleness to them. Let's not ignore them. Let's acknowledge, hey, how's it going? I see you. Yeah. I see you. Yeah. And I think that that's one way that we can just love people again. The other is pray for them. When they come to mind, what if we just stopped and prayed for people in that moment? Jesus says, pray for those who persecute you. Pray for those that are against you. I think it's really hard to hold bitterness and pray for somebody. Yeah. Right? Pray blessing upon somebody. That's really tough. So if those people have caused wounds or that relationship left awkward, begin to just contend for them, pray for them, pray that God would bless them. Not that God would fix them and see the way, you see it and all of that, those kind of self-righteous prayers. I mean, I'm just saying, let's pray for blessing upon people and see what God does in your heart towards them.
That's awesome.
Then when you run into them at Starbucks, it ain't awkward as much because you've been praying, man, I hope God blesses them. I hope their marriage is good. I hope their family is good. I hope their finances are good. I hope God is moving in their life. And maybe they left your church or they moved away or whatever. You're not harboring and holding on to that anymore because you're striving for wholeness. You're striving for holiness.
Yeah.
And I think that when we live like that, like Jesus said, loving our enemies, loving those that don't like us, we are striving for that.
Yeah.
It just looks a little different.
Yeah.
Because we're not besties.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just convicted, in all my relationships, whether they're messy or cookie cutter, like we need to be people who are pursuing holiness and wholeness in our relationships, because that's how Jesus has pursued us in his relationship with us. And we need to be a mirror of that love that we have received. And, I'm just feeling convicted, that with the kindness and, the fruit of the Spirit should be the thing that is flowing out of me and within these relationships. And that's when we find wholeness and holiness in our relationships. So we're just learning to put some tools in our tool belt with these sticky and messy relationships. And we just want to thank you for learning with us and growing with us and joining us for Beyond the Sermon this week. We'll see you next time.